Good afternoon and welcome to Discernment Radio. I'm your host, Danielle Pailly.
And I'm your host, Cindy Riednauer. We are Discernment Radio, people and topics to enhance your life.
Today we're joined by Armando Ubeda and Dr. Angela Collins. Armando Ubeda is a Florida Sea Grant agent with the University of Florida, IFAS Extension in Sarasota County. Dr. Collins is also a Florida Sea Grant agent with the University of Florida and Manatee County. The topic today is red tide, hypoxia, and the effects of climate change on the Florida coastline. Armando Ubeda and Dr. Angela Collins, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
So before we get started, can you each share a little bit more about the work you do?
I'm a Florida Sea Grant agent for the Tampa Bay area, so I work mostly with commercial and recreational fisheries and the shellfish aquaculture industry in Southwest Florida.
And I'm also a Sea Grant agent, but I'm based in Sarasota County, and I have many different programs, and some of them related to living shorelines, Florida Math Naturalist program. I also do a lot of work with children and marine literacy and education in general.
Okay, and I had the privilege of taking a class with Armando for the Florida Master Naturalist program, and I can attest it's a really great program.
Florida has been devastated by red tide, and it looks like it's not going away anytime soon. Can you explain to the listeners what causes red tide?
Florida red tide is caused by a plant-like organism called Carenia brevis. It's a dinoflagellate. It's a microscopic organism that occurs naturally in the Gulf of Mexico. However, when it grows to numbers higher than normal, that's when we have what's called a red tide or harmful algal bloom.
Okay, so it's under normal conditions, it's not harmful and it's ever present, but when it's overpopulated, that's when we have a problem? Is that?
Yeah, when the conditions are right, it's basically a photosynthetic phytoplankton. So it's a little tiny microscopic algae. And when conditions are just right for its growth, the population can grow unchecked. So these guys can divide basically every 48 to 120 hours. A single cell or a single organism can reproduce itself. So if the conditions are correct and they can grow to these unchecked levels, that's when we have a bloom. And we call it Florida red tide. And there are a lot of different red tides that occur worldwide. The bloom that we're referring to here on the southwest coast of Florida specifically is caused by Carenia brevis, which is a dinoflagellate. And these are pretty much specific to the Gulf of Mexico. So red tide is kind of a west coast of Florida problem.
Gotcha. And so what were the conditions that caused this problem?
It's very complex, but some of the conditions has to be temperature of the water. We get warmer waters, calmer waters as well. Winds can increase. If they push the algae, this microorganism, closer to shore, we might have a surplus of nutrients that might also enhance the bloom. Also, cloud cover, believe it or not, if they have more sunlight, like Dr. Collins was saying, it's a phytoplankton. So if it gets more sun, it's more likely to reproduce greater numbers. And
I think it's important, Armando just mentioned that these blooms typically start offshore. So they typically start at least 10 to 40 miles away from the coast. But you can have currents and also winds that can push the bloom into our nearshore coastal systems, and then like Armando was saying, it can be fed by nutrients that might be in the water once it gets in closer to shore. Another consideration is the phytoplankton community. So if there are other species that can outcompete the red tide organism that are present and doing well, sometimes they can actually take up the nutrients or take up the space and help get rid of excess Carenia brevis. So there's a whole bunch of different factors that can feed whether or not a bloom does well or persists for a long period.
Okay, and we'll get into that in a little more detail shortly. First, I wanted you to discuss the impact of red tide on local fisheries and businesses.
Well, red tide can cause killfish, and it can have a big impact in our fishery. If killfish are dying, obviously people cannot go and fish them in shellfish industry because it can affect red tide accumulates in the organs of these animals. So the consumption of oyster, for example, is not recommended because you're eating the whole animal. So it can cause health problems to the consumers. So it does affect the fisheries, not just the pond fisheries, but also the agriculture and shellfish fisheries.
And it's also very impactful on some of our coastal businesses that rely on tourism. So red tide is definitely has some negative impacts on you can feel it. Some people can actually feel it in their lungs. It makes it difficult for folks with respiratory issues to breathe. But then there's also a stench associated with the dying fish that might happen during a red tide bloom, and that can keep people away from the beaches. And so it really does significantly impact our seafood industry, not only because it's killing so many animals, but also because it's limiting people's access to these, beachfront restaurants and communities where they might be contributing to the tourist economy.
And I know a number of restaurants, musicians, people who, because tourism is the largest industry in Florida, and I know a number of people were just out of work for 3 months.
So you were mentioning that it causes respiratory problems and you have shellfish poisoning. What about our pets and our animals that visit the beach?
One of the things that's been recommended is for our pets not to drink water that might be contaminated with harmful algal bloom. Mainly fresh water are algal that might have some toxicity. Most likely pets, won't drink salt water. But however, if you take them to the beach,
they shouldn't, but I know some do.
Yes, some do. That's right. Mine had some that do as well. But it, just like us, it can cause respiratory problems as well, some kind of irritation. And if they drink the water, then yes, they might be exposed to the toxin of this microalgae. So that's why it's recommended to keep pets away from when we have red tides.
So I've also heard that there are so many miles offshore that people can still pick up the respiratory problems. How far away is actually safe?
So that really just depends on where the bloom is occurring. Because red tide is such a patchy phenomenon, you can have little small areas that have really, really high cell counts of the red tide organism. And if the wind is blowing right and the wave action is right, a lot of times it's that wave action and that wind direction that breaks up the red tide organism and releases the brevetoxin and makes it sort of an aerosol form. And that's what's causing the respiratory impacts. So if the waves are breaking it up in the right way, you have really high cell concentrations, or the wind is blowing a certain direction, that's where you're going to be impacted. So it's almost impossible to give it a distance from shore where you're not going to be impacted. It just really depends on where the bloom is in relationship to where you are.
I know a lot of people who were inland were really surprised. They said they couldn't leave their houses because it was so bad.
Sometimes it's just the smell of the dead fish that people are smelling, and they said, oh, it's red tide. But it might not be the toxins, the aerosol that might cause you, breathing problems. It's just the smell of the animals dying.
Which, to be frank, I don't want to be there.
Nobody wants to smell that either.
I know that people are not encouraged to feed wildlife, but I was at the beach the other week, and I noticed birds flying over the Gulf looking for fish, but not diving because there just weren't any fish, or if there weren't many. Do we feed wildlife in cases like this, or are there any emergency measures in place for these situations?
We definitely don't want to feed wildlife, never, because there's many negative factors associated with feeding wildlife, like animals getting used to humans, or animals changing their diet, or eating something that is no nutrition for them, and then can actually harm them. There's also endangered species that you don't want to be feeding because obviously they're endangered, so you can definitely harm them. When these red tides occur, which again is a natural occurrence event, it has happened before, it happened now, it's happening now, it will happen in the future. So we just have to, it's part of life, it's part of the natural cycle. So we definitely don't want to interfere with, these organisms either, trying to help them that way. But what you could do if you see animals in distress, which there are some organizations in our area, south of where we are now, and north of where we are in Tampa, Manatee County, Sarasota County, where they rescue birds. So if you do find a bird in stress, the best thing to do is to call those organizations or call FWC, and then they will take care of the birds and then take it to a place so they can actually rehabilitate them if they can be rehabilitated.
So we wouldn't actually pick up or move or touch the bird in any way. We would call them and they would instruct, either they would come out or tell us if we need to pick them up.
That's right, because you need experts that know the species, they know how to take care of them. Yes, so I think people, good nature, the best thing to do is to call these places. And if you don't have the number of this organization, again, the best thing to do is call FWC, which is Fish and Wildlife.
Okay. FWC.
Yeah, I would just reiterate that it's never a good practice to feed wild animals. And remember that red tide is a naturally occurring phenomenon. It's something that, our local animals that can move away from it will, and they can relocate themselves to find food. And if you do see one that's emaciated or looks like it is suffering an illness, In the Bradenton and Sarasota area, there's the Wildlife Education and Rehabilitation Center does birds, mammals, and reptiles. So that can be like a quick Google search, and you can find somebody there that can come and assist you with that organism. We also have the Save Our Seabirds in the Sarasota Manatee County area, and the Seaside Seabird Sanctuary is in Pinellas County. So those are just some local areas that do rescue suffering, seabirds and other marine critters that might have impacts.
Yeah, you sent us a list, and we'll put those links on the website when we publish this.
So you were mentioning that there's all sorts of hotlines. What about fish and if you see the fish floundering?
So FWC has a fish kill hotline that is, you can basically leave a message 24 hours a day on the fish kill hotline, and they also have an online reporting app. So you can actually download the app onto your phone. So this is the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. If you look on the internet, you can actually find a fish kill or a wildlife reporting app so that concerned citizens can report things to them that might be noteworthy.
So how do we combat red tide? Is there a cure for this, or are we just going to be stuck waiting this out?
Well, we cannot really combat red tide. Again, this is a natural occurrence event. What we could do is mitigate some of the things that might cause or enhance red tide, like nutrients, better management of nutrients, stormwater, things like that. Some of our practices, like, for example, picking up our pets, things of nature can help decrease in the future red tide blooms. But at the present moment, to do something to combat or get rid of it, that's not something that you can do.
So how does picking up after your pets help?
Yeah, the nutrients aren't what cause red tide. Nutrients may feed red tide. So pet waste does contribute. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that contribute. Anything that's going basically into our waterways that can add nutrients. It's a good idea as responsible stewards of the environment to just try to reduce the nutrient input that we share with our waterways. So whatever way we can do that is a really good thing to do, not just for red tide, but for all kinds of different environmental concerns.
And yes, and there's many different things that we can do. Native plants, we have making so many changes on land that coastal development. So if we do it wisely and we do it properly, we can have more native plants bags and things like that that will reduce some of the nutrients that will get into the watershed. And again, like Dr. Collins said, it's not just red tide. So many other different things that we can disrupt by putting a surplus of nutrients with our activities. So anything that can decrease the levels of nutrients that we put out in our watersheds, rivers, creeks, and the Gulf will help not only with red tide in the future, but with other ecological events.
So when you say nutrients, you mentioned picking up after your dog, planting native plants, use of fertilizers. Would you say limit the use of fertilizers? Or are there other things that we can do to reduce putting nutrients out there?
Yeah, I would say absolutely limiting the use of fertilizers is a good practice. Also, minimizing the amount of fresh water that you're putting on your lawns. It's, again, just this runoff gets right back into our coastal system. So this is in addition to conserving water, it's a good thing to not overwater your plants, just because that excess runoff does typically end up in our waterways and carries nutrients with it. Also, when you have the option, use natural land covers instead of just asphalting over something or concreting a driveway. If you can go for crushed shell or some sort of a permeable substance, this also decreases the amount of runoff that's going into our waterways. So any sort of additional filtration capacity that we can add to our land before that water hits the estuary is a good way to reduce the amount of nutrients that are going to be introduced to the system.
And also, when we talk about native plants are already used to this area, so it's easy for them to establish in a new area or an area that that we plant them instead of exotics that they might need a bunch of nutrients to just be established. So having, especially not just native plants, but if you live near the water, if you have a buffer zone, free fertilized zone with just native plants, that they will do well, and you don't need all those extra nutrients to thrive. The other thing that I was going to say is that a lot of people, when they cut their grass, those clippings, they get blown away into the street or into the water, and that's a lot of nitrogen being deposited into the stormwater system or go right into the bay, when you can use pushing those nutrients back into your lawn. So basically, if you cut your grass, put those clippings back into your yard, because that's extra nitrogen. So you don't need to use as much fertilizers. So instead of blowing things away, just put them back to your yard, because you're doing something good for your plants as well.
Oh, two really good tips, because I didn't think about exotics needing special nutrition just to survive. And also, I know, people will blow, maybe not necessarily in the street, but they'll blow their clippings and pick them up and throw them out. So you're saying just blow them back onto the lawn is the best thing.
Yes, definitely.
So red tide is not the only problem we see in the Gulf. Can you talk about hypoxia? What is it, and how does it affect sea life, and how does it affect us?
So hypoxia is an environmental phenomenon where you have basically reduced levels of oxygen in the water. Typically, a hypoxic area is identified as anything where the concentration of oxygen is below 2 milligrams per liter, or 2 parts per million. So these reduced levels of oxygen impact the organisms, most aquatic organisms' ability to survive. So if you have a hypoxic area, the animals are going to move away from that if they can. Hypoxia, like the dead zone in the northern Gulf of Mexico, is a phenomenon that's been identified for quite a long time, and that's typically fed by the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River drains basically the entire eastern Americas, right? And all that freshwater input into the northern Gulf of Mexico basically creates a surface lens of freshwater, high nutrients, and you can have really big algal blooms that can then decompose and contribute to formation of this hypoxic zone on the bottom. But this is a phenomenon that occurs in a lot of different places across the globe. The short answer to your question, I'm sorry I'm rambling on.
No, we love it.
Is that hypoxic zones basically cause all of the aquatic life to move out of that zone. There are some species that can continue to live in really low DO situations, but for the most part, animals that require oxygen are going to either perish or have to move.
So have I been saying algae wrong this whole time? Because I've noticed you use different terms that are not algae. Can you explain for us?
No, you're saying it fine. You can say algae, or if you're referring to a bloom, you typically say algal bloom. And I think that the singular for algae is alga, but I'm not 100% certain on that.
Well, at least in Spanish it is, so I will say yes, it is as well in English.
Okay, gotcha.
So can you tell us how much climate change is responsible for such things as red tide and hypoxia?
We definitely need more studies that relates climate change and red tide. There's not much information that ties the two together or explains them, or if there's any correlation. However, we know that with waters getting warmer, that might increase or enhance those algal blooms, harmful algal blooms. So if we, in the future, if we see water's getting warmer and staying warmer for longer periods of time, then yes, there might be a correlation between, more frequent and more intense algal bloom. But again, there's more studies that need to be done. And that's why it's very important that people realize that it's really good to contribute or support those researchers doing work on red tide, not just when this event happened, but after that, because a lot of people get really concerned when things are happening. But then once red tide goes away, then everybody forgets about it. And a lot of the funding for this research stop. So then it's very hard to do this kind of studies and draw conclusions if you don't have that support. Permanent support.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the other important thing to remember about algal blooms and climate change and all of these things in general is that the human population continues to increase. So our impacts on our coastal communities are only going to become more magnified as we get more and more population density in our coastal areas. So, separating out the climate change and then also the human impacts, and that's just a really complicated question.
No, but those are some really good explanations. And I know, Armando, even over 6 months ago, you had mentioned that we should talk about red tide, get on the show. And look what's happened since then. So you saw it coming.
Well, it happened before. And again, I just think that people just forget. But it's something that is really important to know about. And not just for red tide, but as Dr. Collins was saying, there's so many things that we do that we can do better to decrease our negative impact in our ecosystems.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're saying that you disagree with those people that say that this is just a natural cycle. Is that correct?
No, I don't disagree with it. It is a natural cycle. This happened before, it's happening now, and it will happen in the future. When and for how long, those are the answers that we don't have quite yet, and that's why the researchers are looking into it.
Yeah, I agree with Armando there. this is something that has historically occurred. Red tide has been recorded as far back as people have been writing down exploration off the West Coast. So it's in like Spanish captain logbooks from when they were in the Gulf of Mexico. This is something that is a natural phenomenon again. And this year is a really bad year. We're going on 14 months where we've had the persistent red tide bloom offshore of the west coast of Florida, but it's not the longest and it's not the worst. We've had more severe events in the past. That doesn't mean that this one might not become the most severe, because it is still out there. But it's just important to keep that in mind, that the ocean is a pretty resilient thing and can recover after these really, really bad red tide blooms.
So it's a natural thing, but we can do things to mitigate how we impact it. We can help avoid making it worse.
Correct. And that's what we were talking about, better practices.
So you mentioned some of the things before that individuals can do. Is there anything else you want to add to that? Or do you see anything that governments should do, or neighborhoods, or anything as larger groups?
We mentioned some of the things that you could do. Definitely there's a lot of things that you could do as individual. Just maybe more conscious about, your behavior, how you consume things that you use, car pollution.
Take the Florida Master Naturalist program to become a better steward of the earth.
Yeah, definitely. Be more informed, more educated. Taking the Florida Master Naturalist program not only will give you understanding of your natural history here locally, but also of the region. So you will know more, you will be more informed. Breaking some of these misconceptions is good, because then people actually talk about things accurately instead of just creating all this fictional stuff and confusion among us. So I think, yes, the best informed, the more educated, but then reduce maybe I would say the levels of nutrients that we put out there, like picking up to your dogs, better land management practices. Well, we also have at the IFAS Extension Office, we have people that help convert the landscape into Florida-friendly landscapes. And that's another very good, important thing. So it's many different things that you could do as individual to reduce or mitigate some of this.
Yeah, I would concur. And then from like a policy or government standpoint, I would just say the most we can do as citizens is to encourage our lawmakers to support science and to really value the research dollars that are directed toward identifying solutions or causes or the dynamics of these harmful algal blooms. So supporting our researchers is huge.
So before we wrap up, can you tell us where people can learn more about the Florida Master Naturalist Program and other educational opportunities?
Definitely. The Florida Master Naturalist Program has its own website. So you can go to the Florida Master Naturalist Program website. Also, you can go to IFAS website, and you can have links to the Florida Master Naturalist Program. You can reach out to your extension agents. Each county in Florida has an extension agent, and each county has a Florida Master Naturalist instructor. So you can also reach out to your local office and ask them about these programs. But then you have many different courses that you can take if you're interested. So, and that's the beauty of it, that you can pick up. If you're more interested in uplands, you can take upland module. If you're interested in the ocean ecosystem, you can take the ocean one. And there's so many other ones like wildlife monitoring, habitat monitoring. So it's very cool that you can pick up what you liked, and if you can take them all, you can graduate it. So there's many opportunities. And again, you can go to the Florida Master Naturalist Program website, and you can find all the information there. Where is the class being offered? Who's teaching it? Even where you're going to go, what kind of field trips you're going to be doing. So it's a really great resource, and it's a great, great, great program.
Yeah, just to reiterate what Armando just said, I think it's a great resource that we have in every single county in the state of Florida. The University of Florida IFAS extension offices are just a wealth of information, and there are agents there that can assist with all different. We provide solutions for your life.
That's great. Well said. And I can say that it's a much more enriching experience going for a walk in the forest when you have a clue what you're looking at and what's happening around you. It changes everything. So for that reason alone, I think people should take the class.
Well, thank you both for being here. We've learned a lot today and really appreciate your time.
A pleasure being here. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Discernment Radio. If you like the show, please click to follow.